So Rodney, you've written a number of books around the triumph of Christianity. And what was your kind of interest in exploring that subject matter?
Well, oddly enough, I backed into the whole thing. I started out in graduate school. I was recruited to work on a great, huge survey having to do with Christian beliefs and anti-Semitism, and mostly focused on the religious aspect of it. I wasn't planning to be a sociologist of religion, it just kind of happened. And then through the years, as I was doing this or that, I began realizing that there was a lot of neglect of the history. That, well, for one thing, there were too many historians who were statistically illiterate. That were pretty simple arithmetical things were simply being neglected and overlooked. And so I sat down and tried to figure out what kind of a rate of growth the early church would have had to got as big as it did, and discovered that wasn't really a very rapid rate of growth as these things go, and that it wasn't miraculous, it wasn't strange, it was fairly ordinary. And moving from there, I thought, well, you know, maybe I should start studying the history of the early church, and I discovered I love doing that.
What was it surprised you most about that?
Well, you know, we had the idea that until you sit down and work with the compound interest formula, you don't realize how rapidly let's assume a rate of growth of 3 or 4% a year. And suddenly you get astonishingly large numbers in a relatively short period of time. And when you start playing around with this sort of thing and saying, oh, wow, no, it really wouldn't have taken a very rapid rate of growth to get to 3, 4, 5, 6 million Christians by the year 200, 300, whatever. And it gives you pause and say, now, just a second, this looks like a very reasonable kind of thing. You know, there was an historian that said the most miraculous thing about the growth of Christianity is that it could have grown so large without any miracles. And that's kind of true, that there are religious movements that have come along since that have grown as rapidly. Not as long, but the fact is that once you realize how easily it could have happened, then you can start understanding better how it did happen. Yeah. You don't have to start grasping at implausibilities. You can say, well, what the Bible tells us about what was going on probably was what was going on. And then you start thinking that way, and you start rethinking a lot of things. For example, I was very concerned early on about the notion that this was a movement of the slaves and the ignorant. Because we've got the Gospels to deal with. And they're around by 70, 80. Who could read if this was a religion of slaves and the ignorant? Why would they have wanted any Gospels? You know, do you write them for 2 people? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, I ran across a wonderful Australian scholar named Judge, who pointed out the obvious once it was pointed out, which is the Apostle Paul didn't say, none of you were intellectuals, none of you were educated, none of you were noble, none of you were highborn. He said, not many of you. Well, that means some were. And you look, that opens the whole door. After all, there weren't very many noble people in the Roman Empire altogether. And you start saying, well, if some of them were noble, well, what else is going on? And the next thing you know, you start realizing that there's evidence of Christians in the imperial family as early as the year 50. It changes the whole view. And you don't have to do something radical. You don't have to be one of these guys who comes along and says, you know, I've got it all figured out and it's all backwards, because it isn't backwards. It's right there, and it all works. And I had a marvelous time with that.
There was a number of spaces where you saw that the church, the teaching of Jesus and the early church actually shifted the way people acted within the community. And one of the areas was kind of about need. And so if we would explore the Greco-Roman world, if you were in need in the Greco-Roman world, what were your options?
Little and none. There were no social services. But of course, early on, within the Christian community, there were social services. The Christians did look after the widows. They did look after the poor. An early pope was in fact bought out of slavery. Not after he was pope, but I mean, well before. But they were basically setting up a different model of society. It was enormously attractive. Actually, when you start looking at the early church within the context of the Roman Empire, you wonder why everybody didn't turn Christian, the first 10 years. Take women. Yeah, you really look at the situation of the Greco-Roman women, the Roman women, it was awful. And you compare that with the situation of Christian women, and you really wonder why every woman who ever heard about it didn't become a Christian immediately. I mean, Roman girls got married at 12, 13, 14 to men who were over 30. They had nothing to say about it and very little to say about it, the max. They could be divorced, snap of the fingers, and abandoned. There was no divorce court telling me you have to pay alimony or anything like that. Christian women tended to get married at 18, 19, had a lot of say in who they married. Divorce was thought to be impermissible. It was thought normal for Roman men to play around. It was thought a sin for Christian men to play around. Christian women had simply a much more secure, nicer life.
But it's intriguing, isn't it? Because now people look at what, say, Paul taught about women, and there's this sense of, oh, that's a terrible view. But you're suggesting that he actually shifted.
Well, no. People don't read the whole Bible verse. Mm. I mean, it said, better to marry than to burn. Yeah, right. It doesn't mean than to burn in hell. It means to burn with passion. And then he goes on to talk about marital relations, and he advises people not to be celibate. They could do that briefly for some kind of religious reasons, but that was not the way you were supposed to live. Now, some people like to quote where he says that the woman's body belongs to her husband, but the next line says the husband's body belongs to the wife. Mm. This was very symmetrical. It was very different from what we're always... I mean, I assumed that Paul was against marriage, and he wasn't at all. Yeah. And the Bible isn't. The Bible's very pro-natal, very pro-marriage. In important ways, in the context of the Roman world, very pro-woman.
So, Rodney, what about children? What was a lot of children in the Greco-Roman world?
The Romans often abandoned, if you will. You see, they didn't want to take a little girl out and just cut her throat. So what they do is they lie her up by the roadside. They were talking about, a day-old, 2-day-old infant. And the idea was that if somebody came by and wanted her and picked her up, then she was going to have a life. And if they didn't, they didn't. Mostly they didn't. It's even worse than that. It's very hard, I think, for modern people, myself included, to realize that abortion was widespread in the Roman Empire at a time when there were no antibiotics. They didn't know anything about germs or cleanliness. The fatality rate was enormous. And you say, well, if women were running such an enormous risk of death or serious disability, why did they have abortions? It wasn't up to them. Husbands decided whether or not there was going to be an abortion. And again, here's these older men with these very, very young women. And frankly, wives were easy to replace. And they didn't worry much about it. I mean, this is not a world that we can find very attractive.
So, Rodney, what was it that Jesus taught that the early church picked up on that kind of shifted?
Well, I suppose the main thing he taught is that life was sacred. That the life of everyone, that people were to take care of one another, that we were our brother's keepers, that we had a responsibility to look after the old and the young and the disabled and the ill. It showed up incredibly during the two great plagues that hit the Roman Empire very early in Christian days. The wealthy Romans fled the cities when it happened, including the physicians and the priests. The Christians stayed. They nursed the ill, took care of people, and as a consequence, some of them died of the plague, of course. But Christians survived the plague at a much higher rate because, as a matter of fact, if you give people food and water and care for them during the height of their illness, many of them will survive. And so there it was apparent to all these pagan neighbors that the Christians were outliving them because they're taking care of one another. It was an enormous lesson, but it was the essence of the Christian lifestyle that people care for one another and look after one another, and that there's this much greater sense of an intimate community, a community of believers, but then a community of people who gave money every month to take care of widows and orphans and whatnot. In a world that had no social services, there was a Roman emperor somewhat later, Julian the Apostate, who wrote to the pagan temples and said, "You've got to start looking after the sick people and the poor, because these Christians are doing that, and they're doing it just, of course, to outdo us and make us look bad." It was nothing the idea that they were doing it out of virtue, but of course, his directions to the temples went nowhere because there was no base for it. There was nothing in the pagan traditions about giving money to the poor. The way you gave something to the priests for their care, and you'd buy an ox and have it slaughtered and feed all your friends, but there was nothing there about social services, because there was nothing there about the sanctity of life and about your responsibility to one another.
Today, people would find that really odd, wouldn't they? Because today in countries, Western countries, the kind of sanctity of life, I would guess, and the importance of each individual is just a part of almost the air that we breathe. Right. It's intriguing to think that there was a time where that wasn't the case.
Yes, but then look around the world. It isn't true in many other nations. It isn't true in many parts of Asia that people feel these kinds of responsibilities to one another. Or if they do, it isn't part of the religion. I'm sure there were Romans who cared about one another. I mean, obviously, people do. But it wasn't built into the system. It wasn't part of the thing that everybody was raised believing. And the fact that we have these views in the West is because we were raised in these traditions and in these views. Now, of course, some of this came from the Judeo tradition within which Jesus arose. It's of course the secret of the West.
As we flow on from that, there's a whole number of areas where the early church and the kind of attitude of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, kind of shifted our community. And one of them is in the area of education. Now, we take free education of the communities for granted. Who was educated at these times?
Very few. Literacy probably ran 5%, possibly 10%, but certainly no higher than that. And out in the provinces, much lower. The rich read. And then, of course, that goes back again to my earlier point about why were there gospels by the year 60 and 70 if only the rich could read? And that's because there were plenty of the Christians weren't about a bunch of down-unders. There's a wonderful scholar who's analyzed Jesus' sermons. And he said, you know, these were not sermons aimed at the ignorant. These were sermons that used imagery and comparisons and parables that would be understood by literate people and people of privilege. There was a whole lot about being responsible with your wealth and whatnot. Well, why are you telling desperately poor people that they ought to give their money to the poor? They haven't got any money to give the poor. They are the poor. But again, it seems that the early church was quite different than somehow for a long time people were led to believe, and I guess the popular view still is there.
Yeah. So where did education and say universities as we know them, which is your background, where did they start? What was the
universities started in the 11th, 12th centuries. They were entirely founded by the church. And they were real universities. I mean, they were about studies of higher education, if you will. It was about, science begins in these early universities. Natural philosophy was an early part of the whole Christian outlook, intellectual outlook, is that the world is rational because it was created by a rational God. The world will run according to rules because God not only created on the basis of reason, but he gave us reason so that we could understand things. And the assumption that the world could be understood was the whole basis of what came to be Western civilization. You don't study and look for explanations of how the world works if you don't believe that the world works according to reason. And if you look back in the philosophy of China at the time and what, everybody outside the Christian West believed that the world was incomprehensible because it was an eternal mystery, that you can meditate on it, but it was pointless to try to understand it because it was ununderstandable. The Christians, on the contrary, believed that it could be understood. Some of the very earliest church fathers are saying, we don't understand this today, but we will. We'll understand, and sometimes I was things about what God meant and whatnot, but the whole idea of progress was in fact a Christian ideal. The idea that 20 years from now things will be better and we'll know more. We all take that for granted. But in fact, in most of the world, particularly the ancient world, you would have been laughed at if you said such a thing. It turns out it was true. The Christians were right. The universe could be understood, which is why, in fact, we're sitting here talking on camera and it's going to be shown over a television and whatever, because this stuff only happened because we thought it could happen.
You did some research on the first scientists, didn't you?
Yes.
The first people that we kind of, as scientists, as we understood them.
Right.
And science and scientists are often pitted against Christian faith.
Right.
What were the first scientists like?
Well, the first scientists really go back to the early universities, and they were all ordained. I mean, we're talking about priests. Some of them were cardinals even. And then when we come into what's called the scientific revolution of the 1700s, these were profoundly religious men. And I say men because there weren't any women among them for all kinds of reasons. But the fact is that Newton wrote a lot more theology than he did physics. He was a very religious man. Most of them were. There was only one, Halley, who probably was irreligious. Probably 20–30% of them were actually priests and ordained. They were a very religious group of people, and they were in religious universities for the most part. They not only saw no contradiction between religion and science, they saw nothing but a meshing and a complete fit between religion and science. And the fact of the matter is, most scientists do today. They don't write books about it, and they don't get themselves on the media like, Dawkins and some of these people, with their... But the fact of the matter is that religion, we have science because of religion. That's how much it fit together. And there is no necessary inconsistency. Religion is not about the material world in the sense when we're talking about the existence of God and whatnot. Science is only about the material world. Science can say nothing about whether an immaterial or spiritual world exists or doesn't exist. Scientists can say they don't believe it, but science as such can't tell you anything about a non-material realm. So there's no overlap, and the two have no need to collide at all.
Yeah, going back, those first universities often and hospitals often came out of kind of monastic movements and monasteries. Give us a picture of what they were like, because I guess today we tend to see here's a group of people that locked themselves away and left the world. What were monasteries like, and what difference did they make?
Well, monasteries were communities. People, of course, dedicated their lives to the church, but they didn't lock themselves up. They weren't unworldly. They had their livings to make. And consequently, capitalism was invented in the great monastic communities of Europe. When the people running the monastery said, no, we don't give our stuff away. And the marvelous thing about the monasteries, of course, is they could make long-term economic plans, and they would always be they were meritocracies, of course, because they didn't have to deal with idiot sons. The nobility had to deal with the fact that they'd come along with a guy who wasted all the money or was an idiot or whatnot. But in the monasteries, it was always, they didn't put idiot in charge. They always took the smart guys and put them in charge. I'm sure there were plenty of idiots in the monastery, but they just didn't give them responsibilities. And they were these wonderfully run factories and whatnot. What we've got going on, it was amazing because they early on specialized. And consequently led to a money economy because trade was very inefficient. And so the guys who were making wine bought their food from other places that were raising food, and they bought their horses. There was one famous monastery in Italy that specialized in nothing but good horses. That's what they did. They bred and raised horses. It was an amazing time.
Did they just Were they just money-making enterprises? What else did monasteries do?
Oh, well, of course they were intellectual operations. Some of them wrote books. They did a lot of worshiping. These were seriously religious people. I did a little study in which I took the medieval saints from the year 500 to the year 1500. I coded them up, and the marvelous thing is 20% of them were from the nobility, and most of the rest of them were from the very, very privileged. I'm sorry, many more than 20%. 20% were from royalty. Almost 60% were from the nobility. The point here being is that the connection between the monasteries, if you will, because most of them had been monastics, the monasteries and the political elite was like members of your family are doing one or the other. And so you got brothers and sisters who are in the monastic movement. It held Europe together in interesting ways, and it put some moral constraints on the nobility because the family members who were monks and nuns would say, you shouldn't be doing that, dad or brother or sister or whatever. And it tied Europe together in some very interesting ways and imposed a morality.
It's interesting because that kind of whole process of education, and there were and
Right.
not only with universities, but there was also educating children,
Right.
and then that developed more into literacy because they wanted people to
Right.
read the Bible. But that actually had an influence on the ability of democracy to rise, didn't it?
Well, sure. I mean, literacy spread further in Europe than it did elsewhere in the world. Well, for one thing, of course, Western literacy is easier than, say, in China or Japan. I mean, learning 6,000 or 7,000 unique symbols to become minimally literate, that's pretty hard. When in fact all you have to do is realize that you're just sounding out the words you're speaking. That's a whole lot easier to learn how to read. And in that sense, the West had a huge advantage, and literacy was much, much more easily achieved. People admire how hard Chinese kids work in school. Well, that starts on the fact they've got to work really, really, really hard just to become barely literate. There's no sliding by on those schools because literacy is so difficult.
And then literacy and education actually gives people just a wider concept of what their rights are and shifts the community.
It gives you a much larger body of the public who can be involved and will be involved. Of course, these things, it was in the Italian city-states that in medieval times that you got democracy re-emerging from the Greek tradition. And one of the reasons is that you had a substantial middle class in these cities. And yes, a lot of literacy, and this whole fundamental Christian conception of humanity, you really didn't have the sense, as you did in many parts of the world, that the upper class were almost of a different race, almost a different breed of humans than the rest. And there was a lot more moving up and down. There were people who went in the army and became leaders who came out of pretty low backgrounds, but talent outed, or breaks or whatever. But there was much more fluidity in the system, and You know, that goes back to the early days of the church, the idea of buying people out of slavery. And one of them ended up Pope. I mean, you know, that's not the sort of thing that you see in non-Western situations, or in the old days at least, where if you weren't born in privilege, there was no privilege for you.
So Rodney, this series is called Jesus the Game Changer. And with all the study and research you've done, how would you see Jesus as a game changer?
Western civilization would not exist had not there been Jesus. I did a book called How the West Won, the neglected story of the rise of modernity. And basically, in the early important times, it's rooted in the church, it's rooted in Christianity, it's rooted in Jesus. These things didn't happen in the rest of the world. You can say, well, you know, this, that, and other thing was invented in China, right? But it led to nothing. I mean, you even take something as simple as gunpowder. Whether that was invented in China or simultaneously invented both in China and Europe, we don't know. Doesn't matter. The Chinese used it for fireworks. And within a few years, I mean very few years, of gunpowder being available in Europe, you've got church bell manufacturers all over Europe casting cannons. And in 1517, when the Portuguese reached China, they had firearms, they had cannons on their ships, and the Chinese didn't have any of them. Maybe the Chinese invented a clock. We don't know for sure. But they didn't know what time it was when the Portuguese got there because they didn't have any clocks. There were clocks all over Europe. And all of this goes back to the fact that Christianity believed in a rational world, a rational God, a God of justice, God of logic, God of virtue. All of these things conspired together to make it possible for us to be here in this kind of a civilized world. Even though there are many uncivil aspects to it, it's still the best that we could do. And it wouldn't have been done. We wouldn't have medicine, we wouldn't have hospitals, we wouldn't have automobiles, we wouldn't have any of this if it hadn't been for the start of the whole thing, which was Jesus.